News of the day. We got a lot of things to cover, so let's get started. We have a bunch of stories for you. I'm going to be talking about valuation, markets, fundamentals, and also talking about the news. Most important is item number 7, condoms and tuxedos flying off the shelves. So let's get started. If you have any questions, make sure that you put it in the chat. Any questions, put it in the chat. So I see Austin already in there. Make sure you ask any questions, Austin. All right, let's get into it. First, I just put together this table on valuation. I looked at PE, price to book, price to cash flow, dividend yield, ROE relative to book value, and PEG ratio, meaning PEG, PE relative to growth. And here you can see that at 20 times PE, the developed markets are about 1.4 times more expensive than emerging markets, which are at 14.3 on a PE basis. Europe and emerging Europe in particular is trading just below book value. Now, that's different from developed Europe, where you can see it's traded on 2 times price to book. So in theory, emerging Europe looks interesting, but I would say there's some question that I have about the earnings there. The only other thing I would highlight is that the US is at 21, North America is at 21.8, and that's mainly the US. So I would say my expectation is the US is expensive. The rest of the world is not so expensive. Let's get an update on price changes. The first thing is that Asia's stock markets are up, are on the rise and are catching up. We had a weak 3 months, but year to date, countries in Asia have suffered relative to, let's say, the US, which was up about 10%. And here we can see Asia starting to rise in the last week. Why is it important? Well, also, if you look at it from a longer term perspective, and we look at emerging Europe, emerging Asia, over a 3-year period, these countries have done relatively poorly. And this is an important thing to mention, is that the momentum in the Asian markets, I believe there's still opportunity in that the markets in Asia and emerging markets generally are not as expensive as the US market. So I see it as somewhat of a place to be. So any questions, just put it into the questions in the chat. Let's continue on and look at fundamentals. And what we can see is ROEs between developed and emerging markets are very close. Emerging markets now are earning about 13% ROE and developed markets about 14.5. Now you could say, well, that's being depressed by a very low ROE in Japan, which is at 8.4%. In fact, if you were to compare, let's say, emerging Asia is at 12.4, and in North America, meaning the US, is earning about 18.7. You could say, well, that's part of the reason why Asia is cheap or emerging markets are cheap, because their ROEs are lower. We can see net margin also lower in emerging markets. Its dividend payout ratio is the one thing that is about the same. So finally, let's just look at some countries in Asia. I start with Thailand and go down Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, and the like. The key thing is that India remains most expensive on a price to book basis at about 3.2 times price to book. And the highest dividend yield is in Malaysia at 4.5%. We also see pretty high at 3.9% in Singapore. And Singapore is super cheap at about 1.2 times price to book. All right, let's get into the news of the day. Amazon nears deal to buy MGM Studios for nearly $9 billion. Well, Amazon is in talks to buy Hollywood studio MGM Holdings for $9 billion. This would be Amazon's biggest acquisition since its purchase of Whole Foods in 2017. This is part of Amazon's plan to strengthen its Prime Video services and compete with Netflix and Disney Plus, HBO Max, and Hulu. As big players eye to gain market share in streaming services, we could see more M&A activities in the sector. An investor could benefit by investing in Roundhill Streaming Services and Technology ETF. Now, this is an ETF that's focused only on streaming services. It's an important thing to note about ETFs. They're a new innovation in the markets over the last decade or so, and they're a very handy tool for building different types of exposure. When ETFs first started, they were just to build indices like S&P 500, but now you can see that they can be tailored towards certain areas. In this case, streaming companies, and that ETF just owns streaming companies. So in that sense, what that ETF is doing is giving you exposure just to streaming companies, but in a portfolio format. All right, Belarus faces EU flight ban for grounding Ryanair plane with dissident. Biden denounced the Ryanair flight grounding and calls for the release of the main opposition leader, Protasevich. Now, this guy is only, 26 years old? And Biden also welcomes EU's plans to impose targeted economic sanctions on Belarus. During the political crisis last year in Belarus, Putin warned EU leaders against interfering, and Biden and EU's opposition against the Russia-backed Belarusian government could escalate tensions between Russia and the US and EU. You know, I think that this particular story is significant. We looked at it yesterday when it started to happen. And yesterday I actually misspoke. I said that there was another precedent before where a government asked that a plane be grounded, and that plane, I said, was going to Ecuador, which I was wrong. The plane was going to Bolivia. That plane was going from Moscow to Bolivia, and it was holding the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, at the time. And basically, U.S. government pressured Italy, Austria, and Switzerland, I believe, and Spain to basically say, refuse this plane to be able to land in any of those countries, and it had to circle back and then land in Vienna. And that was because they thought Edward Snowden was on the plane. The Americans were the first country under Obama and Biden to use this strategy of actually forcing a jetliner down. And they forced down a jetliner of carrying a sitting president of another independent sovereign country. It was one of the biggest breaking of protocols and of diplomatic management of all times. And of course, now the U.S. basically criticizes the other countries for doing the exact same thing. The main issue on this particular topic is that it just raises tensions between Russia and the U.S. U.S. is the master at overturning governments around the world, and they don't like the current Belarusian government. And so this gives them more ammunition, and they're going to put pressure on that. And we've even seen in Ukraine that the U.S. government under Biden and Obama was instrumental at overthrowing the Ukrainian government. And I suspect they want to do the same in Belarus. Now, this is where I would argue Trump was a little bit different. He just didn't want to get involved in this type of thing. But I believe that the State Department under the Biden administration, they want to do this kind of stuff. So we'll see. Next story is from Reuters. U.S. Treasury Deputy Chief sees G7 backing for 15% plus global minimum tax. I hate tax. Well, let's go into the story. U.S. Treasury expects support from G7 nations on U.S. proposed 15% minimum corporate tax. This received positive reaction from France, Germany, Italy, and the Japanese governments. The U.K. is also particularly focused on enforcing taxes on large tech companies. The 15% tax could benefit non-multinational companies in low-tax countries, as they may not be under the same jurisdictions. Investors could consider buying those companies. But you have to keep in mind that when the U.S. wants something, they're going to eventually get it through the exercise of their power. They're going to basically push all of those European countries to sign up. And, you know, most of them want to probably sign up to that anyways. And then they'll use the strong arm of the U.S. government to try to strong arm other companies, other countries for participating. Now, there's two sides to this. You know, the one side of this you could argue is that these big tech giants are generating revenue all around the world, and they're really avoiding paying taxes in different places. But again, I also think that I have a prediction, and this is a bit of a weird prediction, but my prediction is that everybody in the world will be paying taxes to the U.S. within the next 5 or 10 years. So if you live in Nigeria, you're going to pay maybe 1% of your income to the U.S. government. Now, that's a crazy prediction, I know, but the point is that the US government is going to charge everybody for its services as policeman or woman to the world and for protection, kind of like a mafia boss does protect the people that pay them. Now, this type of collaboration on taxes and forcing a tax regime could be just the beginning of that. Next story, Singapore approves COVID breath tests with 1-minute result. What the heck? Singapore startup Breathonics developed a 1-minute COVID breath test, which will be used in a trial for travelers from Malaysia. The new COVID test claims multiple benefits, like average 94% accuracy compared to 72% accuracy in the current rapid test, and then 3 to 4 times cheaper than the current rapid test. And it does not require a healthcare professional to operate. Wow, that could be a game changer. That's interesting. So, if proven successful, we may see travel restrictions loosen. Currently, Breathonics is in talks with overseas organizations to use the system. And this could also disrupt and decrease the demand for American-based rapid tests. Here's some companies, Quidel Corporation, Abbott, and Ginkgo Bioworks are companies that have been in the testing business. If the Singaporeans can cut the cost of testing dramatically, you can only imagine the reaction. I suspect the reaction is going to be governments colluding to push out this Singaporean solution because maybe it doesn't match FDA approval and blah, 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 so that the bigger companies can continue to make a ton of money in testing. I doubt that this company will be able to mass scale their product out to the world, but it will be interesting if they do. It means lower costs for all. But one of the things that I don't like about the way the world operates these days is that it's not really free market capitalism anymore. It's big companies colluding with governments to get benefits. So let's see. Maybe that will be the case and maybe not. All right, next story. Reuters talks about the global property market is ready to soar this year. Well, a Reuters poll showed an increase in house price forecasts, which is expected to outpace economic growth and inflation. In contrast, demand for commercial space is not as high as residential properties. Now, here is some of the output of their piece that they reported here. This comes from Reuters. I just highlight the one on the left that shows 2021, and this is average price, house price change for the year by country. And you can see Canada is expecting 15%, US and Australia are both expecting about 11%, and then in England expecting about 5%. So a lot of high expectations there. Next story. Oil companies close the taps as fear of civil war grows in Colombia. Colombia is the 4th largest oil producer in the world, and it's facing its 3rd week of anti-government protests. Petroleum production fell by 6.5% from March 2020. Companies are reducing oil production, and protests could further delay exploration. Also, there's reignited fears of a possible civil war. Peace negotiations are unlikely and violence could escalate if the government deploys the army to remove blockades. Oil pipeline bombings and kidnapping of oil industry workers, which happened frequently 2 decades ago, could also come back. So if we look at this particular story, one of the things that I've learned about the US over the years is that it meddles in governments all around the world. And so watching what the U.S. reactions to this Colombia situation is going to be interesting. And I don't know much about it, but I'm curious to watch what happens there. But it's sad, ultimately, any violence and any disruption in a country. The last story of the day from the Wall Street Journal. The Great American Cleanup. Deodorant teeth whitener fly off the shelves. So beauty products such as teeth whiteners, perfume, and nail polish were big sellers at Walmart. Surge in demand for products related to people's re-entry into normal interaction is also evident. These include swimsuits, condoms. Wait a minute. People haven't been using condoms during the crisis? Huh? What? And deodorant and sunscreen and tuxedos. So condoms and tuxedos? Could be. That could be make for a really interesting night. And due to America's disposable income increase during the pandemic, they're willing to pay higher prices for better quality goods. This could benefit retailers and consumer good manufacturers like Walmart, Target, and also Procter & Gamble, Unilever, and Johnson & Johnson, right? And we've seen a lot of stories about what's happening in America where people have either earned money from their job or are earning unemployment benefits from the government. And also we know that there's been some pent-up demand. So people that do have money will bring it back out to the market. Let's see if we have any questions before we end up. So the first question of the day is, Amazon move on MGM is considered to be monopolistic activity. Well, obviously, what's going to happen is they'll have to go through the trade commission to try to apply to see if they'll be allowed to do the merger. But I suspect that they'll say, wait a minute, Netflix is already a huge competitor. They're the monopolist, not us. But it could come under some antitrust questioning. So next question comes from Munling. Will the global minimum tax hurt the global stock market significantly? I would say at this point, probably not, because a lot of companies under the Trump made some big tax change for U.S. companies operating abroad that basically brought the cash back that they already had. And I think also what happened is that people are expecting that under the Biden administration that taxes will go up. So I would say that it probably isn't going to be a huge thing, but I just think it's steps to make sure that governments have control. Okay, our next, Jay Lally says a smile. All right, next one. Thank you. Then the next one from Chris. With increasing competitors in the streaming services sector, which company do you think will stand on top? Well, ultimately, you've got two ways of looking at this. I think that Netflix will always kind of have its leading position. But the thing that Amazon, as well as Disney and others are trying to do is basically, if you picture the typical American household, you've got a husband that may like to watch sports, and you had a wife that may like to watch, let's say, documentaries or something like that. And the result of that is that if you have a streaming service that only has sports but no documentaries, or only has documentaries but no sports, you may not be appealing to the whole household. So the idea is if you bring in other things, other streams of videos and content into that company, then that streaming service could be, really, really benefiting. So, and Jay says, Roku. I haven't looked at Roku. It's a long time since I've heard of Roku. Next question. Sundar says, semiconductors, Thai companies that could benefit from the shortage. That's a good question, and I'll have to look at that. Thai companies that would benefit from the shortage. Well, I don't think we have Thai semiconductors. We do have Thai assemblers. So we have companies like Hana Microelectronics, SVI. These guys are using semiconductors. I'm trying to think of who would benefit. I don't have an answer for that right now, but let me ask my Valuation Masterclass students to think about that, and we'll come back to you. Good question. All right, next question. Titigon says, question about last news. So all QE money goes back to big businesses. That's why Biden's trying to tax more from the rich. Well, I definitely think that QE and the Fed basically bailed out the biggest companies, and small companies, medium-sized companies were crushed. And also we saw that a lot of individuals didn't get much, even though they lost their job. So you can definitely say that QE tends to benefit the big banks, the big companies, and all that. And you could say the higher part of society that may have the higher education and all that, maybe intellectual knowledge workers, whereas restaurateurs, people that are working in restaurants and like got hurt very badly. So maybe they're trying to get more tax. I think that the 15% tax is not really an idea about increasing tax. It's an idea about how to make sure that companies like Apple, as an example, can't escape and put a company in, let's say, Ireland and get a super low tax rate, or Liechtenstein or Belgium and get a super low tax rate. That's really what it's going after. I think in the US, everybody expects that Biden's going to increase the corporate tax rate, which is now about 20%. All right, next question comes from Tapadit. All right, do you think the Chinese government will still go after Chinese tech companies? Will this be a constraint for growth for these companies? I think that the Chinese government wants massive Chinese tech companies because they want them to compete with massive tech companies from the West. It's just that the Chinese government wants those tech companies to do what they say. And when they don't, then they run the risk of getting, their leaders kidnapped or other things, or getting disappeared. So there's a lot of question I have about that. But ultimately, I would suspect that the Chinese government wants to see its big companies being competitive in the world market. That looks like that was the last question for the day. I want to thank everybody for your questions, and hopefully that news gave you some knowledge that you can use to improve your investing. Have a great day.